Are we? Okay, welcome everyone. Just a brief intro of me if you don't know me already. I'm Erica Desper. We are on a journey with our son to get him diagnosed and supported. And all along that journey, I'm trying to share everything we learn along the way with other families because it is very important. And I don't want anyone to have to wait till age 13 to get this information if you don't have to. So the most recent piece of our journey was meeting Dr. Goyne and getting diagnoses of auditory processing deficits for our son. And I just loved his explanation of what that involves and treatments that are available. So that's what we're going to share with you tonight. So this is Dr. Goyne of Aberdeen Audiology. And if you have questions, we'll get to them toward the end. So feel free to put them in the chat and I will turn it over to you, Dr. Goyne. Thank you so much for generously giving your time to us.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for having me. It's, I like, I'm going to share my screen here, everybody. I like doing stuff like this. Pretty much everything an audiologist does is, people aren't always terribly familiar with, but when we get into auditory processing stuff, it flies under the radar even more. So I'm always happy to get the word out there and help everyone know what we do. So this is, as Erica said, this is an introduction to auditory processing, diagnosis, and treatment. And, really, treatment is a big thing because if you do a little bit of research on auditory processing, a lot of what's talked about in terms of treatment isn't really treatment. It's accommodations, which are good and are helpful, but it's good to know that there is actual treatment so that when an individual is in a situation where there aren't accommodations or it's difficult to apply the accommodations, then, hopefully they've had some treatment to fall back on. So a little bit about me. I promise I'm not going to read my whole resume here, but I do think it's good to know who I am and what an audiologist is, and then that way you kind of know maybe the direction from which I'm coming. So, I'm a doctor of audiology, James Madison, Go Dukes, University of Florida. I'm the chief audiologist and owner of Aberdeen Audiology, which we've got an office in Wayne and an office in Westchester. And it looks like we could have a third office coming soon. We do some of the usual, yeah, right. I think, woohoo, I think. But we do a lot of the things a lot of audiologists do in terms of hearing aids. We do a lot of that, but we also do cochlear implants. We do balance evaluations and treatment for people with vertigo. Of course, auditory processing, evaluation and treatment, which is what we're going to talk about tonight, tinnitus, and just general patient education. We do a lot out there. I'm also a professor. I teach current and future doctors of audiology at Salus University, which is merging with Drexel sometime this year. So go Dragons, I guess. In terms of what I like to do, I like doing stuff like this. I like having talks with folks. I like answering questions. I like making things more efficient if we can do that. I don't know if Erica, you would agree that things were efficient when you were there, but I like to make things efficient.
Yes, everything. And I'm not just telling you, everything was very efficient and easy, which has not been the case for a lot of the appointments that we've needed to make.
Yeah. And then, clinical problem solving and mentoring. I enjoy doing all that stuff. So enough about me, enough. So, what is auditory processing? A lot of folks have maybe a little bit of a guess, but they're not quite sure. There's two quotes here that I like to use. The first is by Jack Katz. If there was a Mount Rushmore of audiology, he would be on it. He's written some textbooks about audiology in general, but he did a lot of research in the areas of auditory processing and auditory training. He's 90 years old and he still sees a couple of patients a month. And so he's just an absolute icon, rock star. But he says it's very simple. It's what our brain does with what our ears hear. Really our ears are just kind of fancy microphones and they don't really do much processing. The next quote drives that home even more. One of his students, who's become a really good friend of mine, she was probably one of his last students. She trains a lot of audiologists to do this kind of work. She says our ears are like the hardware of the auditory system, and the brain is like the software. So, you know, I'm in my basement right now, and there's a fan blowing over there. It is my brain that knows that that is a fan, and it is over there, as opposed to a motor that's over there. It's my brain that knows all that. The ears just pick it up and send it north, and it's for the brain to figure out. And we'll get into that a whole lot more later. You know, there's sort of the way to think of how our brain works with sound. First is detection or awareness, right? So, you know, it is your ears that are picking up and sending it to the brain. And so first the brain decides, aha, there's a sound there. The next thing that comes is discrimination. It's the brain figuring out, sort of in my example earlier, well, that's a fan, not a motor, or not rain outside. You know, it's differentiating things, and that comes into play in the identification portion of it. So discrimination is really more knowing there's a difference between a fan or rain outside or a motor. Identification is being able to specifically identify what those things are. And then comprehension, that's, you know, there's where we get away from my example a little bit and we talk more about a spoken message. That's where the brain, you know, really kind of puts it all together and gets the meaning of it. And so as an audiologist, we deal quite a bit with those bottom two layers of the pyramid there, and we get a little bit into identification as well. When we start talking about language matters, that's really when it's best for a speech therapist to get involved. But in terms of identifying certain phonemes or sounds of speech, that is something we definitely can get into and help. So you know, we help with a certain portion of this little pyramid. And, you know, as you might imagine, as you go up higher up the pyramid, the more cognitive resources that are involved with all of that. And so I heard a statistic just a week or two ago that I had not heard before, or if I had, I forgot. The average person hears 20 to 30,000 words in the course of a day. That is a lot. And so, and if you assume that each word averages 4 to 6 phonemes, and phonemes are the individual sounds of speech, not words, but the sounds that are within words, then that's somewhere between 80 and 180,000 phonemes in the course of a day. So that is a tremendous amount of speech sounds that comes at somebody. And if you also think about it, those speech sounds, acoustically, a lot of them are very similar. So if I say ah or ah, acoustically, that's really similar. You know, if the alien overlords ever come down here and listen to us talk, are they really going to know that there's a difference between an ah and an ah, or a s and a sh and a th and a th? Like, you know, those last couple that I did, they're just blowing air. It all sounds like a leaking tire if you stop and think about it. So you know, and in the course of running speech, all of these phonemes, with all of these very subtle differences, are flying at somebody really, really fast. And so the brain has to detect the difference in all of those sounds, identify them, put them together into words, and sort of hold them in short-term memory while it decodes the next words, and hold those in short-term memory while it decodes the next phonemes and words. So you're decoding and you're holding in memory, and you're decoding and you're holding in memory. And then, oh, by the way, if you're trying to do this in a classroom that's even moderately noisy, now you have to ignore something that's going on over there and something that's going on back there while you're trying to decode what the teacher is saying. And so, you know, now you're getting into multitasking. And so all of this that goes on when processing speech, it requires a lot of cognitive resources, a tremendous amount. We don't realize how much it takes up because we do it all day, every day, and we've done it all day, every day, our entire lives. And so we just sort of take it for granted, how much effort it takes. But it really, if you do functional MRIs and things like that, and look at what the brain is doing when it's listening and digesting speech, there's really a lot going on up there. And so again, hearing the difference in that random fan and maybe a dehumidifier over here, that's pretty low level, easy stuff. But processing speech, where all of those different subtly different complex sounds are coming at you really, really fast, that gets tough. That gets tough. And so, if you really want to get into the weeds, you'll find that there are a whole lot of different models that talk about auditory processing. But really, all of those models are sort of describing the same things, just in different ways. It's almost like, the English language and the Spanish language and the French language and the Italian language can all describe a slice of bread. They use different words, but they're talking about a slice of bread. And so the model that Jack Katz put together and Angela Alexander teaches a lot of people about, and what we use in our clinic, is the Buffalo model. And so within the Buffalo model, it sort of breaks auditory processing skills up into 4 different categories. One is decoding, and that's, I've already sort of described it really. That's hearing and detecting and discriminating all those little differences in speech, in the sounds of speech, the phonemes. There's another category called tolerance hyphen fading memory. Basically, the way to think of that is really it's like auditory working memory. And so that gets into, you're decoding while you're ignoring something, or, auditory multitasking. Or maybe you are getting a set of directions and you're decoding them and you're trying to remember them so you can do them in the proper order. That's all auditory working memory, or tolerance hyphen fading memory. Tolerance just means, can you tolerate noise? Fading memory means, how good is your short-term recall? But really, the way to think of it, and I think a term that gets used a lot these days, working memory, just put auditory in front of it, auditory working memory. Another category, and I should say, by the way, decoding and the working memory, we come across those a lot. That is the lion's share of auditory processing issues that we run into. Sometimes we run into auditory integration. That is how the auditory system collaborates and shares and integrates information with other systems, like the visual system. If somebody is lip reading, which most people do lip read, we don't realize it, but most people do. If you're lip reading and listening to somebody, you're sort of integrating visual information with auditory information. But integration can also mean just how the brain processes sound that comes into each ear. Again, if I was down here with my eyes closed, I would know that fan is over there because my brain, detects that it gets picked up in this ear first and this ear at an ever so slight split second. And the brain knows that because it's integrating information from both sides. We don't run into that quite as much, but we do sometimes. And then auditory organization, that is how the brain organizes sound when it comes in. Again, that comes into play a lot with maybe getting phonemes backwards in a word, or it could mean in multi-step directions, getting the order out of whack. So, if it's, when Jimmy comes home from school, if he's told, Jimmy, hang up your jacket, take off your shoes, go upstairs and start your homework. If he, kind of starts to head upstairs first and forgets the jacket and the shoes, maybe he didn't forget it. Maybe he just got them out of order. And that, that's sort of a bit of a hypothetical there, but, we all, we all bombard our kids sometimes when they come home from school with directions. So here's sort of some characteristics, warning signs that you might run into out in the real world. And so if somebody has a decoding problem, well, how does that exhibit itself? Well, they might be a little slow to respond to something. So there could be like a pause before replying. Just simply asking what or huh a lot is a sign of a decoding issue. Difficulty in oral reading accuracy. So not comprehension, but just oral reading accuracy. That can be a sign of it. This is really important. If you have a decoding problem and your perception of all of those phonemes is off, then when you're learning to read, you're going to have difficulty associating those sounds with the symbols. And that's really how reading starts, is you're taking sounds and you're associating with symbols on a page. And so if your perception of those sounds is a little off because of a decoding problem, it's going to translate into oral reading accuracy, which will eventually snowball into issues with reading comprehension down the road. Difficulty learning a new language, responding inconsistently or inappropriately, mishearing, something like that, getting, words that sort of rhyme confused or something like that. If somebody's got a tolerance fading memory, or as I call it, auditory working memory problem, they're going to have difficulty hearing in background noise. And every classroom has noise. Restaurants certainly have noise. Cars, when you're riding in cars, they have noise. Buses, when you're riding in buses, they have noise. Getting tired from listening is a sign of this. Getting distracted by sounds, is an example of it. And just difficulty focusing and maintaining attention can be a sign of it. Integration, dyslexia, visual perception deficits, poor handwriting, poor spelling, they can all be signs of integration. Although, I could easily take poor spelling and put it up with decoding as well. So that one can go a couple of different ways. Organization, well, actually, I should back up. Integration could also be not really fully being able to localize where a sound is coming from. That can be an integration issue as well. I think in my next version of these slides, I'll have to put that in there. Organization, some signs of that is if somebody's kind of disorganized, if they get instructions out of order, as I said, that can be a sign of all that. And then there's some things that, in the healthcare world, we call them comorbidities, but, some things that can occur along with auditory processing issues. So the previous slide, that's things that somebody with an auditory processing issue might exhibit. This slide is more about if somebody has one of these conditions, that may also be, it also can raise the likelihood or probability of an auditory processing issue. Ear infections as an infant or toddler, that can lead to auditory processing issues. Basically, if there's a whole bunch of fluid behind the eardrum and the eardrum doesn't vibrate the way it should, it just sort of throws off all of that wiring that goes on in infancy and toddler stages to, as they're learning speech and beginning to figure out what things mean, what all those different weird little phonemes mean. If again, there's a lot of fluid in there, it kind of throws off that wiring that goes on. Hearing difficulties in the presence or absence of hearing loss. So if somebody just says, I feel like I have a really hard time hearing, and yet they have a hearing test that was normal, that's a sign of an auditory processing issue. In children, speech and language delays, similar to reading, if your perception of those phonemes is off, if it's kind of muddied, you're going to have a hard time then articulating it or putting it into words yourself. Any number of learning difficulties. Sometimes I think some kids may not have certain learning difficulties. They actually just have auditory processing issues, but it's a sign. Reading difficulties, as we talked about. Concussions. Before I started with auditory processing work, I thought it was going to be a whole lot of, 8, 9, 10-year-old kids who are struggling in school, in particular reading. As it turns out, we work with a whole lot of folks with concussions, because that can cause auditory processing issues, can also cause some balance issues. And so that's kind of nice with us having a balance center and obviously doing this auditory processing work, we can help out a whole lot of folks. And then, our old friend ADHD, that can be a sign of it as well, a comorbidity. Basically, if you have ADHD, there are internal and external distractions. Those internal and external distractions draw cognitive resources away from the already difficult task of processing speech. And so it gets difficult to focus. It gets difficult to focus on speech when there's, any sort of distraction, whether it's internal or external. So probably in our office, probably 1/3 of, we've run the numbers. I think it's 1/3 or 35% of our auditory processing patients also have a formal diagnosis of ADHD. And then there's maybe another 10% or 15% that we suspect probably has it as well. They just don't have a diagnosis. So on these two slides, if any of this is going on the left column here, or if any of this is going on, auditory processing needs to be on the radar. The good news is, as I said earlier, there is evidence-based treatment for auditory processing issues. Again, it really flies under the radar. A lot of people don't know about it. A lot of people know about preferential seating or FM systems, but they don't really know that there is such a thing as auditory training. And so it's well supported in the research, but basically what we do is, one round of therapy is essentially 12 sessions. We sit down with somebody 12 times, an hour each time over the span of 12 weeks. We do it over Zoom, which is great. There's a lot of features in this app that don't really get used. We'll do some things with sharing the screen, and the patient will touch the screen and make decisions and choices and things. But basically, we're working on decoding. We're working on the working memory. We're working on sequencing. We're doing a whole bunch of things in the span of that hour to get the patient's decoding and their working memory and their sequencing and their integration in a better place. Again, research really supports that it works. In our office, when we've run the statistics, we see success 92 or 93% of the time. When we've run the statistics, we are defining that as at least one standard deviation of improvement on the tests. And so that's the objective measure. The subjective measure being the patient or the parents can point to things and say, yes, this was more of a problem before, it's getting better now. That was a bit of a problem before, it's better now. And so 93% of the time we see success after just 12 sessions. There's not a lot of things in the speech and hearing and language world where you can do 12 sessions and see some improvement. I should also add that research study there in the middle of the screen. I reference that a lot. I have an audiologist on my team now. She graduated a couple of weeks ago, and in the fall, she's going off to work on a PhD. So she's really interested in research. She has run some statistics in our office about auditory training, and it's amazing how closely it matches the statistics from that study that I mentioned there in the middle of the screen. So it works. I'm still kind of amazed, frankly, how well it works. Maybe that previous slide is just to maybe even convince myself a little bit better that, my gosh, this really does work. It's not the only thing. There are remote microphones. They were called FM systems up until about 10 or 15 years ago. They used to use FM radio. We don't really use it at the FM radio anymore, but they still sometimes go by FM, in terms of their name. But basically, it's something where a teacher or a speaker wears a microphone. That microphone picks up the sound and beams it into some sort of device, like a speaker or a hearing aid or a hearing aid like thing, near or on a patient or a student. And basically, it just makes the teacher's voice stand out above everything else that might be going on in the classroom. Also, something that is also well supported in research, and we've seen success with it in our office as well, is what's called low gain hearing aids. Now, folks with auditory processing issues, they almost always have normal hearing. But so it seems odd. Well, wait a minute. If they have normal hearing, why would you be using hearing aids? Well, basically, hearing aids are really good at emphasizing speech. And they also have some noise suppression characteristics in them. And so what we can do is we can apply just a little bit of amplification, meaning low gain, just a little bit of a boost. And that makes the soft sounds just a little bit stronger. And then the noise suppression. And so when you get that greater separation between what you want to hear and what you don't want to hear, that makes the decoding easier. It makes the working memory, frees up some of that. And patients do better. So just this morning, I read an email from one of my audiologists sharing just the news, how one of our patients was just blown away by how well the low gain hearing aids worked. So that's an option. I'm a little partial to the auditory training because I just like the idea of rewiring somebody's brain. But these things work too. Couple of success stories really quick. How are we doing? Oh, we're doing good on time. This one is, and by the way, names have been changed to protect the innocent, as they used to say on TV shows back when we were Amar, age 8. His mother picked up the phone and called us because he was struggling with spelling, reading, remembering / following multi-step directions, a lot of the warning signs that we talked about on some of the previous slides. Looks like on 2 of our tests, he was more than 3 standard deviations below the mean, which means that if we gathered up 100 8-year-olds, 99 of them would perform better than him on these tests. Now, I would like to say to you that it's really rare for us to run into people that are 3 standard deviations below the mean, but in our office, we actually run into it a fair amount. So much so that I sometimes wonder, are we doing something wrong? And then I'll put somebody in the booth that I know has normal auditory processing and we get normal results. But I think it just goes to show that really people are only finding us if they're having overwhelming difficulty. I would love to get to the point where we are seeing people with only mild and moderate difficulty in addition to the folks with a severe amount of difficulty. But at any rate, more than 3 standard deviations below the mean. His responses were consistent with decoding and tolerance rating memory, as I talked about on previous screens. We did auditory training via Zoom. By the way, we have patients that live literally 5 minutes from our office, and we still do it over Zoom, just because it's logistically easier for everybody, when it comes to carpooling and piano lessons and soccer and whatever else goes on after school these days. So after therapy, the auditory training, he improved to 1.5 standard deviations below the mean, which probably means that somewhere between 2/3 maybe or less of 8-year-olds would perform better than him. But that's a whole lot of improvement, going from 99% to, let's just say, 60% maybe. So that's pretty good. And that was on the SSW. On the phonemic synthesis test, he got to just slightly below average. So that was pretty good. And one of the reasons why I just like and remember this case quite a bit, partially because it was one of our early ones, but also the mother said, I never realized before that he didn't engage other children to play. And I noticed the other day that he will now initiate conversations with other kids that he doesn't know on the playground. So, this was her first kid. And so she didn't really realize that, hey, maybe kids, actually do this. They go up to other kids and try and talk and try and play. And she just didn't pick up on it that he wasn't doing that. But after the auditory training, he started just doing that. He just felt more comfortable getting into conversations, so he would initiate them. And it wasn't a conscious decision on his part. But I just thought that was a cool little thing. We focus so much on academics, which are incredibly important, obviously. But there's a social side to things, too. And so I thought that was kind of cool. David, age 12, they got in touch with us. They were struggling with reading comprehension, in particular word problems in math. I don't know if you guys have noticed, but they start word problems really early in school these days, which in a way I think is good, but it starts a whole lot earlier. He would turn the TV up loudly, as it turns out, not because he had a hearing loss, but just because he wanted the TV to stand out above whatever else was going on in his house. Difficulty following verbal instructions. And a younger sister with similar issues was diagnosed with APD by our office, and so. After we diagnosed her, and the mother got a little more educated about what auditory processing is, she began to notice it in other corners of her house. Perhaps I need to put that back on one of my earlier slides as a warning sign. He was well below the mean on a lot of our tests. In this case, the parents actually opted for low gain hearing aids and a remote microphone system rather than the auditory training. The mother reported that teachers are noticing he's more attentive in school, and though he was nervous to wear them at first, his friends were supportive, and he seems less tired by the end of the day. So in other words, he was putting forth so much mental effort to just hang in there and try and understand what was going on all day in terms of auditory information, that it was mentally taxing. And look, just even with good auditory processing, even with great auditory processing, when you're trying to learn new topics, that can be, mentally tiring. Who knows? I might be tiring some of you out right now, but not boring, right? Not boring, just tiring. So at any rate, he was just less tired because it was requiring less cognitive resources, which I thought was really cool. let's see, what else do we have here? Oh, so this one's a little bit different. It's not a kid. It's actually an adult. Kathy, age 46. She was, maybe still is, maybe she's graduated by now, but graduate student in a PhD program plus a day job. So a 40-hour-a-week gig and then grad school at night. And oh, by the way, has several children. She struggled to follow discussions in class. She was mentally wiped out at the end of the day. And she was constantly asking her kids and husband to repeat themselves. I can also remember her telling me that the PhD program she was in, there would be a lot of group discussions, breaking up into teams and doing some problem solving stuff. And she would have a lot of difficulty following the conversation. For her, she actually tested out about 1.5 or 1 standard deviations below the mean, which, doesn't put her exactly, squarely behind the 8 ball, but she was consistently below average. In her case, we did both. We did low gain hearing aids and auditory training. She said, look, I want to do the auditory training. This will be great. I think this is the way to go, but I need help now. I can't wait, a couple of weeks to get started and then 12 weeks for it to finish. I need help now. So we got her low gain hearing aids to start, and we did the auditory training as well. And she said, I'm amazed at how much energy I have at the end of the day now. And I remember so much more from class. I don't have to relearn it all on my own, which I thought was pretty cool. I should check in with her. Maybe she might be finished that program by now. So I ran through that a little fast, which, may not be great for digesting and auditory processing, but I did. So, but we've got plenty of time for questions. Awesome. So, what questions
I have
are
a
there?
few of my own.
Sure.
So I'll do those while everybody thinks. If they have any, feel free to throw them in the chat. We're also a tiny group, so if anyone just wants to, unmute and shout it out, I think that's fine too.
Yeah.
So of course, to talk about our experiences, I'm sure other people can relate. So you decided that our son doesn't have a disorder per se. It's not enough below you have the word standard deviation to be qualified as a disorder. And so I just wanted you to touch on the fact that there can be deficits that impact socializing, academics, et cetera, that can be treated that still aren't like at the disorder stage, right?
Yeah. A very good point. I'm glad you asked that question. So, sort of maybe the way to think of it is there's, maybe normal auditory processing, maybe ever so slightly below average. Then there's auditory processing deficits, and then there's an auditory processing disorder. So there was actually a petition going around a little while ago, signed by myself and a whole bunch of other audiologists, sort of asking the professional organizations that we are members of to either make some of this terminology a little bit more clear, or just sort of reduce the standards for being labeled with auditory processing disorder. But basically, we end up doing several tests in an auditory processing evaluation, and both the American Academy of Audiology and the American Speech Language Hearing Association, they say that in order to qualify as a auditory processing disorder, you need to perform 2 standard deviations below the mean on 2 or more tests, or 3 standard deviations below the mean on 1 test. Now, again, if you know how standard deviations in statistics work, 3 standard deviations below the mean means that, you're at the bottom. 99%, maybe 99.9% do better than you do. Right. And to me, that strikes me as a pretty significant deficit. And I feel like the bar should be a bit lowered. Or if you're 2 standard deviations below the mean on 2 tests, well, that means that 90% of the population was beating you out on 2 tests. And so it just strikes me that that's a pretty stringent definition. And so basically, in my office, if somebody is performing below average on these tests and they are expressing difficulty, then we get to work. I don't sit there and say, well, look, you didn't meet the definition of an auditory processing disorder. You may feel like you're having some issues. You're below average, but, sit up front and turn up the volume and good luck. So, if somebody's having difficulty, and they're at least even just below average on some of these tests, we'll get to work. Now, if you're looking to get, you know, extra supports or accommodations from school, well, then you might have to meet some of those definitions. But in my office, we're happy to get to work and help you out. With varying degrees. On one of those previous slides, as you saw, Kathy, age 46, technically she did not meet the definition of an auditory processing disorder, but she was pretty consistently below average. One standard deviation below the mean means that 2/3 of 46-year-olds would do better than her, right? So, yeah, I hope that clears that up. You can have deficits and a whole lot of problems. You don't have to have just a disorder to have a problem.
For sure. And I do, Audrey, I see your question, so we'll get to that in a second. That brings me to my school test versus private test question, because another thing we experienced was that the school sent our son to their, an audiologist at the DCIU. They proclaimed that his hearing was normal and that his processing was normal.
Right.
And of course, then you guys found some deficit. So obviously your answer is biased. We know that, but can you touch on the differences a little bit and why that could happen?
Yeah. There's a couple of different reasons. So one, unfortunately, there really is no gold standard for, these are the tests that are done in an auditory processing evaluation. End of story, right? There's actually, I don't know, we should count it up sometime, but there's actually a whole lot of tests out there that will test different components of auditory processing. And, a lot of audiologists will sort of use a lot of different tests. And so, I think sometimes what will happen is you may just do a set of tests that, happen to hit on the strengths of a person's auditory processing and sort of miss the weaknesses. Mm-hmm. Also, though, there are some biases out there, and there are certain segments of certainly speech therapy for sure, but also even in audiology, where there's some debate as to whether auditory processing actually exists. Some people think it's just, a component of ADHD. There's some folks who think it's really more just a language disorder, not an auditory processing disorder. To a certain extent, I don't know that I care. I mean, even if auditory processing is just a symptom of those things, well, fine. There's still things we can do about that symptom. Sure. So sometimes when people are doing the testing, they have those biases and they're just kind of, I don't know, looking for a reason to pass somebody. Can
we talk about that bias?
Yeah.
What's that?
So I'm a psychologist, and
okay.
And I know within psychology, like that's a huge debate about whether auditory processing is an issue, and I think it's a fascinating conversation, and I wish that we had some way of making sense of that debate. So I was just wondering if, because a lot of things you're talking about are, just, and I'm not saying I just think it's a complex question, and I was just wondering if you have any thoughts on the subject to add.
Yep. No, it is complex. So I'll tell you what sort of swayed me on all of this was, well, let me back up even further. So when I did my training, like 9 or 10 presidents ago, there really, I mean, I was taught by my professors that, I don't know, we don't know about this auditory processing stuff. Like all of these research studies are done on people who had brain lesions, and, do people with these unique brain lesions really, does that translate? Can you apply that information to the general population? People who don't necessarily have a traumatic brain injury in a specific spot in the brain, does it translate? And so I, being a young and impressionable audiologist, I was like, yeah, that makes sense. Okay. And, then moved on to hearing loss and hearing aids and balance testing and that sort of thing. But you know, as the years have gone by, I've gotten a whole lot more familiar with auditory. I'm sorry, with ADHD for personal reasons, and that got me thinking a whole lot more about the brain and understanding it a bit better. And then, you know, kind of opened my mind to it a bit. And then, what really though swayed me is when Angela Alexander, who I talked about on one of the earlier slides, she showed me videos of people before and after auditory training. And so, you know, some of these before videos was somebody who was, you know, not confident to carry on a conversation, lots of, you know, sort of slow to respond. And then after auditory training, you know, much more engaged in conversation, much more willing, just brighter. You know, I don't mean bright in terms of intelligence. I just mean personality was brighter. Personality was more engaged. And then, you know, and then I started reading some more peer-reviewed journals that shows that auditory training improves all of this. And it's not just, well, hey, maybe you're teaching for the test. Like you've got those tests and you do this training that gets them doing better on those tests. Well, there's also subjective measures where people are given a questionnaire about their issues and their problems. And, you know, they you know, their handicap inventory is reduced after the training as opposed to before. So, you know, it became a matter of seeing the videos of these people, but it also became a matter of reading the peer-reviewed journals and really realizing that the research had come a long way since I had learned about it in the late 90s. And honestly, I was probably consuming research that was 10 or 20 years old at that point. So for me, I think it's there. I do see where sometimes people can think, well, maybe it's just like a symptom of ADHD. But and as I sort of said earlier, you know what? Even if it is, there's something we can do about that symptom with just 12 hours of work. So I feel like even if it's just a symptom, let's get to work on that. To
But
that
if,
end, though,
but
well, hang on. Yeah, let me say one more thing
no, no,
about ADHD.
no, I'm not disagreeing with you. I was just going to
Yeah,
say, if that's true,
yeah,
it's not just a symptom.
right.
If what you're saying is true and auditory helps, whatever. I mean, like then
Auditory training, yeah.
auditory training helps. Then then it's not ADHD.
Well, maybe. I mean, you know, again, we have kids who definitely have ADHD, and we've
Well, it
done
could
the
be
auditory
also,
training.
but like,
Yeah,
yeah, I mean, it
yeah,
could be still occurring, but
that's true too. Yeah, yeah. But along those lines, though, there was a research study done. Um, I believe Jack Katz was actually one of the co-authors, I guess. Basically, though, the tests that we use, the speech and noise test, the staggered spontaneous word test, the phonemic synthesis test, they were done on a group of kids that were diagnosed and medicated for ADHD.
mhm.
They were taken off of, I think it was Ritalin, for 2 weeks, and then they were given the tests again, and no other intervention or treatment in there. And statistically, there was really not much difference in the test. So that, you know, that sort of gives you a sense as to how ADHD may or may not be playing a role in all of this.
Interesting. Okay. Well, and I know, I would say from the parent perspective, um, I always want to express this to parents, trust your gut. So we got that, clear report back, the first one. And I was like, it's just, I don't even know all the details of what you're sharing with the research and all of that. I just knew in my gut, he wants the captions on when we watch TV. He says what and huh all the time. He's very slow to respond. He has social challenges. I just knew something was happening between, like you said, the sound going in his ear and then his brain doing what it needed to do with the sound. So that's why I like to point out that not all the tests are equal. And I think what you said is exactly what happened. In our case, they happened to choose tests where he managed to perform fairly well, but when other tests were chosen, his deficits became a little more clear. So thanks for explaining that.
Yeah.
And Audrey wants to know, Audrey was told that nothing can be done for, I always say tinnitus, but you say, what do you say? Tinnitus?
I say tinnitus, but
Well,
it's
hey, you're
also
a
I
doc.
think
I
it's
don't
potato
know.
potato. It's
um,
potato potato. Yeah.
okay. Nothing can be done, and a whole lot of people, like 1 out of 2, have it. What would you say to that?
Uh, well, I don't know that it's 1 out of 2, but it is a lot. It is a lot. A lot of people have it. And I literally had somebody in my, it was the last patient of the day, a woman in her early 50s, um, had sort of a sudden partial hearing loss, which caused the tinnitus. And it was really bothering her. And she said, "Boy, I hope you can help because I'm reading a lot of stuff online that says nothing can help." So, and it is frustrating because the fact is there's a lot we can do to help. So, uh, tinnitus almost always is a symptom of a change in hearing. Now, it could be somebody who went from really, really, really good hearing to just normal hearing, but that's a hearing loss for them. And so, it's not, their hearing is more than good enough to still pick up the acoustics of speech just fine. But that change in hearing does cause the tinnitus. And so there's plenty we can do about it. What we do, though, is a little bit different for every patient because every patient is a little bit different. And so there's just we just have this large toolbox, and sometimes we apply one of the tools, sometimes we apply a bunch of the tools. It kind of depends upon the patient when the tinnitus bothers them, what it sounds like. Is there hearing loss? Is there not hearing loss? What's their lifestyle like? Um, I will say though that while hearing loss or a slight decline in hearing is what causes the tinnitus, there are things that can exacerbate it. Stress can exacerbate it. This particular woman I'm talking about today had a stressful event that I believe really, really ramped it up.
Hmm.
So stress can ramp it up. Caffeine can ramp it up. Sugar can ramp it up. Salt can ramp it up.
Oh, the things
I
they love.
Yeah, alcohol in um, alcohol in slight amounts may have no effect or even help just a dash, but more than slight amounts ends up, then the dehydration kicks in, which can ramp it up. Dehydration ramps it up. What am I leaving out? Fatigue can ramp it up. Side effects of medications can ramp it up sometimes. So, there's a lot that goes into it. I'm able to help folks with it. And then once we get to a certain level of complexity in the case, we actually have a tinnitus specialist on my team. And sometimes it gets a little bit more complicated for me and we pass on to her. Sometimes we pass on to psychologists. Sometimes cognitive behavioral therapy can help a little bit with it. It is frustrating when you hear nothing that can be done about it. That was true for a number of years, but honestly, for the last 21, 22, 23 years, we know what to do to help it. There's things we can do.
Awesome. I hope that was helpful. Let us know if
Yeah.
you have any follow-ups,
But
Audrey. Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, the first step, last thing I would say, the first thing to do is to get a hearing test and visit an audiologist who knows what they're talking about when it comes to tinnitus. That's the first thing to do. And I find that if you go and see an MD about it, because it can't be helped with medicine or surgery, they kind of say, well, nothing can be done. But
Right.
no, there's stuff that can be done. So anyway.
Okay, awesome. And Rosanna, I'm going to do your question next, but that reminded me. So if we're looking at the difference between maybe a low gain hearing aid on the auditory therapy, is the difference that hearing aid is more of an accommodation that that person will probably continue to need versus the training is going to rewire the brains that they wouldn't. It's like a permanent gain. And I think you told me, but you didn't mention this, that there are tests to show like you track the gains later and they aren't lost and the training doesn't need typically to be repeated.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, you said it. You're good.
Okay.
No,
Oh,
it's
see,
basically,
now I'm an audiologist.
yeah, really. Show up tomorrow. We'll get you started.
I'm tired.
No, but
I love that point as a parent because we've been done so many rounds of things that are infinite We don't know if there's going to be an endpoint. We don't know if there's going to be
Yeah.
regression. And it was just so thrilling to me to hear it might just be 12 sessions and you gave
Yeah.
percentages. It was very specific. And then whatever you gain, you keep. And I really love that.
Right. So yeah. So that's that's kind of why I'm partial to auditory training over low gain hearing aids. So whatever improvements we see, they stick. So for the long, we've been doing this work for a number of years now, and for the longest time, I was bringing people back 1 year later to test them again and make sure that nothing had changed. And in the last 6 months, I've just sort of decided, you know what? I'm not going to bring people back once a year for this anymore. Nothing changes. It sticks. I'm very clear that if somebody, I tell folks, if you think you're having more difficulty, if you think it's wearing off, so to speak, come on back in. We'll test you again. We can do the auditory training again if we need to. But really, in 5 years, we've had one person get back in touch with us and say, I think it came back. But that was a different thing. That was somebody who had a concussion that caused the auditory processing. And then after we treated her and she was in a pretty good spot, she then got long COVID / brain fog. And then that caused it all over again.
Yeah.
But so, if we train you up and we get you doing better, and assuming you don't have a bump to the head or long COVID or whatever the next pandemic is, you should be good. And so
Okay.
whereas with hearing aids, look, they work, but they last 5, 6, 7 years. So if you do the math, if you're replacing hearing aids every 5, 6, 7 years, that gets pretty costly. And but also, you're wearing glasses right now. When you take those off, your vision goes back to where it was without the glasses, and it's
Yep.
the same with with hearing aids and auditory processing. So they definitely work. If auditory training is not an option, we're more than happy to use it and do it. But I don't know, it's just not where
Yeah.
my
Well,
my
and I like
preference
how
is.
you paired it in the case of the adult who was like, I need a quick fix, but I'll also do the 12. That seemed
Yeah,
like the perfect. And she probably wasn't embarrassed like kids might be which is another factor. Will they wear them? Will they lose them? Will they break them?
yeah,
Um, definitely more training for my son than an item.
yeah.
Okay, thank you for that. Roseanne, do you want to unmute to ask your questions or do you want to type them out for me in the chat and I'll read them off?
I'll unmute. That'd be
Yeah.
great.
Hi, how are you?
Good. Thanks for inviting me to this.
Yeah.
So I thought I was here for my daughter with Down syndrome. She's starting with a new speech therapist. It's actually her friend who's just very good at speech therapy, and she had asked if Celine, my daughter, has auditory processing issues. As though she's always passed her audio exams, her audiology. So, well, that's not the same thing. And then I saw Erica invited me to this, so I have to understand what this is now. So does when my daughter was getting her audiology exams years ago, she's 13 now.
Okay.
A lot was going on. So I mean, we had the
Right.
heart surgery, we had everything. So they may have been speaking to me about the audiology, auditory processing, and I was missing it, and I did not know what was going on. Is in your experience, is the children's hospitals that give the audiology exams, do they deal in auditory processing, or
Yeah.
does she need to go to a specialist in order for me to find out if she has auditory processing issues?
Right. So actually, at the risk of tooting my own horn, if you were to call Children's Hospital of Philadelphia and ask about auditory processing, they would send you to me.
Okay.
So it's just this niche within a niche, and at this point, I really like doing this kind of work. I really enjoy doing this kind of work, and I've delegated a lot of the hearing aid stuff, for hearing loss in the older population. I've delegated that to a lot of the folks on my staff, other audiologists, because I really, really like doing this. And I think this is something where you really do have to be into it to do well with it, because it is kind of a complex issue. So you do need an audiologist to test it. One thing I would wonder about is people with Down syndrome are known for having middle ear issues, meaning ear infections. And so I would wonder if maybe she had, I don't know, you tell me, maybe she had some ear infections when she was younger, and that kind of got the auditory processing in an inefficient wiring, so to speak, and maybe that's where it's coming from.
Yeah,
If it's
I
even
don't
there at
know.
all, it might not be there.
I don't even know if it's there at all. I just know that she struggles with speech. She struggles with reading comprehension. So if I can get her any help that I can in any different direction, or find out if there's more than one issue, I want to find out and then see if I can help her with it. Um,
Yeah,
we
I'm
might be
so
hanging
glad
with
you
her
saw
for,
that this was coming up.
yeah, very timely.
yeah, yeah.
And that
Yeah, I
brings
mean,
up a
there's
question, Dr. Goyne. Can anyone, like, is there anyone who's not a good candidate for auditory training? Does it have anything to do
Oh,
with
mm,
cognition or
yeah.
IQ or like any of that? Or could
yeah,
anybody benefit?
yeah. So I'll answer that. Let me say one thing quick that
Sure.
entered my mind about the speech therapist. I will say that I've had numerous speech therapists tell me that kids that they sent to me, and we found something and we did our thing and got them in a better spot. Um, that when they went back to the speech therapist then and got going with that therapy again, they saw a whole lot more traction and they made a whole lot more progress a lot quicker. So I'm not saying that, look, everybody who goes in to see a speech therapist really should see us first. I'm not saying that. But, depending upon what's going on, it is possible that the speech therapy will be more successful if there is an auditory processing issue, that gets straightened out. But when you ask, is there ever a time where you would not suggest auditory training? So if you go back to the statistic I gave, where 92 or 93% of the time we see improvement, as I mentioned maybe in my first or second slide, I like clinical efficiency. I want to see how good we can get with stuff. And so I wanted to see, okay, what's the deal with the 7 or 8% that don't improve? And the general trend was not great engagement with the sessions. And by not great engagement, I mean sort of two different categories within that. One, you know, um, parents or even in an adult constantly calling to reschedule and cancel at the last minute. And so the 12 sessions, instead of taking 12 or 13 or 14 weeks, the 12 sessions took 20 or 21 weeks. And when you're doing something that infrequent, it's hard to get any headway, any momentum with it. So, because really the sessions we do, they kind of build on each other. And so if you're taking a lot of time off and you're doing them kind of inconsistently, you don't get as much traction. So that was one thing we saw. The other was maybe they were there weekly the way they were supposed to, but they just had a hard time sitting there and engaging with it and touching the screen when they were supposed to and doing the things they were supposed to do. Some of that could be, back to our friend of ADHD. It could have been like a 6 or 7 year old with a whole bunch of ADHD that just couldn't sit in the seat to do it. It could be sometimes maybe someone a little bit older, but there's some autism there, and some behavioral issues that come along with that sometimes. And so, just not being able to sit and engage with it.
So it's more individual versus like, oh, this one diagnosis, it just doesn't work.
Yeah, I mean, I think if I guess if somebody popped up, I'm trying to imagine what the test results would be. I think if somebody popped up with, um, only an auditory organization issue, maybe then we wouldn't recommend the auditory training. But to be honest with you, pretty much everybody that comes through the office has decoding and tolerance fading memory issues. And then it's just really a question of whether or not they also have some organization and also have some integration issues. The decoding and the tolerance fading memory are almost always there.
Awesome.
Okay.
Thank you. And
Can I
Roseanne,
ask
you
my
had a question
second?
about another kiddo?
Yeah. Yeah, so I thought I was here for my daughter with Down syndrome, but
Surprise.
I have three daughters, and another daughter has.
Same.
I know. I
Okay.
forgot to have you tell everyone you're a dad. You're in the trenches with us.
Yep.
Three
I'm probably
daughters.
behind you in the pickup line. I'm probably right there
Probably.
behind you. But anyway, go ahead.
No, it's fine. So my 16-year-old is neurotypical. Always struggled with focus. Eventually she went for executive functioning. We were doing that. She tells me she struggles with reading, got her evaluated last year by the school. They said nothing's wrong. So we'll give her a 50, what is it, the 504, which means nobody really does anything. Pretty much.
Topic for another night, right?
So I was thinking of getting her to maybe like this some sort of reading specialist. But then when I was looking at your slides and it said that reading difficulties could be part of it and executive functioning. I'm saying no. Now, is this something else I should be maybe looking in for my daughter too? You know, is this maybe what is the beginning of what's causing everything else? You know,
Right.
what came first?
Right.
So I
Yeah.
don't know if I'm just trying to put things together, or do those really have you seen ties to reading and focusing and executive functioning and auditory processing?
Yeah. I mean, in cases like this, and I don't, I'm very wary of, there's that phrase, when you have a hammer, the whole world looks like a nail. So I don't want to make it sound like we should be testing everybody for this, but,
I was just thinking that in my head. Why aren't we testing everyone for this?
yeah, well, in my mind though, there's two possibilities. Both of them are good. Let's say you bring her in, or anybody where you're wondering, anybody who's wondering, maybe it's there,
Right.
maybe it's not. Let's say we test and let's say we find it's not there. Great. You now cross that off your list and you move on to other stuff that could be causing, the issues that you're running into.
Right.
Or the other bright side of it, the other half full part of it, is you find there's actually an issue, but as we talked about, there's actually stuff we can do about it. So something good is going to come out of it. You'll either find out that's not it and you can move on to other stuff, or you'll find out that's it or a component of it, and we can get to work.
Right.
I think about times where I've had just again, 3 daughters having a conversation in between games at a soccer tournament. The parents are trying to do anything they can to entertain themselves, and conversations lead from one place to another. And I remember having a conversation with a friend of ours about their son, who was not on this team, was not present, and she kind of said, yeah, he's kind of, I don't know. Sometimes it seems like he just doesn't pick up on stuff. It's kind of weird, and he's having some troubles with reading, and I don't know. It's kind of weird. And I said, really interesting. And I started asking more questions. Again, we had like an hour to kill, so might as well do a case history, right? So one thing led to another, and had him into the office, and he was somebody who was kind of in that sort of 1.5 standard deviations below the mean kind of a thing, and and so we got to work and we got him doing better. So I realize I'm biased, and I realized I'm maybe seeing things looking a little bit like a nail everywhere I look. But, if there's trouble reading, I always wonder, could that be auditory processing? And then, I don't need to know, right? And, but, when you say there's some neurodivergence there, that can play into it. So, if you wanted to, this not just for you, anybody on this, anybody who's listening now, or anybody who watches the recording later, I'm happy to trade emails, have a conversation one-on-one. There are plenty of times where people set up a video chat with me and they're wondering if they should get tested or not, and we talk through it. Most of the time, I think it's a good idea, but sometimes I say, you know what, I really don't think that's it. We're happy to do the test, but if I were you, I would do this first instead, or I would do that first instead. So I'm happy to trade emails or have a conversation.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
And Roseanne, I would consider, so we could have had this same conversation talking about vision processing, which is another thing my son had struggled with. And I did have that conversation with Dr. True. I'll send you the link for that as well, because similarly, that is linked to, you can have fine sight, but the way you process what you're seeing. So there could be tracking issues. There could be issues with the eyes working together, convergence. So,
well, similarly, as I said, this is just hardware and the processing goes up here.
Right.
It's the same with vision. Like the eyes are just light sensors. They're
Yep.
light sensors is all they are. And it's the brain's job to figure out what that light means.
Yep.
So
So that can definitely cause reading struggles.
Yep.
That go undiagnosed or misdiagnosed. So we'll get you to the right place. That's why we're here.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks very
Wonderful.
much. I appreciate
Yeah,
it.
I'm glad that ended up being doubly helpful. And yes, everybody has your email address here on the screen, Dr. Goyne at aberdeenaud.com. They can find you at aberdeenaudiology.com. I will send this recording out in an email to everyone who registered. It'll go into the video library that I'm collecting for parents and professionals at specialneedscollective.com. You can go back and watch it anytime. I think those are all of our questions, unless anybody wants to jump in at the very last second. I don't think so. All right. And we managed to keep you here not too much over an hour. That was excellent. All right. Well, Dr. Goyne, thank you so much for your time and your
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, your explanations are just, you made it all very simple, and it is quite complex, but easy to digest. And I can't wait to share this with everybody. And I look forward to, on a personal level, we look forward to working together this summer. We'll see how far we can get, and we'll be one of your statistics, hopefully.
Yeah. Sometimes one of your statistics, that sounds like a bad thing, but I mean it in a good way. We want you in the 92, 93%.
Exactly, in that part of it. All right, wonderful. Well, thank you for everybody joining us tonight and watching it later. And I'll be back soon with some more information that you maybe didn't even know that you need. Thank you.